"You can insult me," Caleb Rose said quietly, "but do not touch that collar." Rain whispered across the nearly empty parking lot, turning the yellow lines beneath Atlas's paws into blurred streaks of light. The German shepherd stood close to Caleb's left leg, calm despite the cold water darkening his black and tan coat. Three young men faced them beneath the bright white glow of a luxury SUV's headlights. Their clothes were clean, their laughter careless, their phones already raised. Mason Whitmore held Atlas's worn leather collar in one hand, as though it were nothing more than an old strap pulled from a roadside animal. "This thing?" he asked, smiling toward his camera. "You're getting serious over this?" Caleb did not answer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still carried himself with the quiet balance of a man who had spent years learning when to move and when not to. His faded work jacket was soaked at the shoulders. A pale scar crossed the edge of his jaw, nearly hidden by the rain. Atlas stepped forward once, then stopped when Caleb lowered 2 fingers beside his thigh. No command was spoken. None was needed. The dog's amber eyes stayed fixed on the collar. Mason's friends laughed again, but the sound felt smaller now. Across the lot, shoppers had begun to pause beneath the store awning. A woman clutched her grocery bag against her chest. An older man lowered his umbrella. No one yet understood why the veteran had allowed every cruel word to pass without reply, or why the dog had remained so still. Mason swung the collar loosely from his hand. A scratched metal plate tapped against the buckle, producing a thin, familiar chime. Atlas's ears lifted. Caleb's expression changed. Not anger. Something older. Something carried home from places he never discussed. "Put it down," Caleb said. Mason looked toward the growing audience and mistook restraint for weakness. He let the collar fall. It landed in a shallow puddle with a soft splash, the leather sinking beneath a ribbon of rainwater and oil. For one breath, the entire parking lot seemed to hold still. Atlas lowered his head, but he did not move. Caleb's hand settled gently between the dog's shoulders. "Stay with me," he whispered. Mason nudged the collar with the toe of his expensive sneaker, turning the metal plate toward the headlights. Mud slid from its surface. A line of stamped letters caught the light. At the edge of the crowd, a silver-haired man in a dark wool coat suddenly stopped breathing. His umbrella slipped from his hand and struck the pavement. He stared at the plate as though the past had risen from the ground to meet him. Then he stepped into the rain, his face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Mason glanced back, annoyed. "Dad, it's just some dog collar." Richard Whitmore did not look at his son. His eyes remained on Atlas. The old German shepherd turned toward him, ears forward, body motionless. Richard's voice broke into a whisper. "No," he said. "That dog was reported dead." "You can insult me," Caleb Rose said quietly, "but do not touch that collar." Rain whispered across the nearly empty parking lot, turning the yellow lines beneath Atlas's paws into blurred streaks of light. The German shepherd stood close to Caleb's left leg, calm despite the cold water darkening his black and tan coat. Three young men faced them beneath the bright white glow of a luxury SUV's headlights. Their clothes were clean, their laughter careless, their phones already raised. Mason Whitmore held Atlas's worn leather collar in one hand, as though it were nothing more than an old strap pulled from a roadside animal. "This thing?" he asked, smiling toward his camera. "You're getting serious over this?" Caleb did not answer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still carried himself with the quiet balance of a man who had spent years learning when to move and when not to. His faded work jacket was soaked at the shoulders. A pale scar crossed the edge of his jaw, nearly hidden by the rain. Atlas stepped forward once, then stopped when Caleb lowered 2 fingers beside his thigh. No command was spoken. None was needed. The dog's amber eyes stayed fixed on the collar. Mason's friends laughed again, but the sound felt smaller now. Across the lot, shoppers had begun to pause beneath the store awning. A woman clutched her grocery bag against her chest. An older man lowered his umbrella. No one yet understood why the veteran had allowed every cruel word to pass without reply, or why the dog had remained so still. Mason swung the collar loosely from his hand. A scratched metal plate tapped against the buckle, producing a thin, familiar chime. Atlas's ears lifted. Caleb's expression changed. Not anger. Something older. Something carried home from places he never discussed. "Put it down," Caleb said. Mason looked toward the growing audience and mistook restraint for weakness. He let the collar fall. It landed in a shallow puddle with a soft splash, the leather sinking beneath a ribbon of rainwater and oil. For one breath, the entire parking lot seemed to hold still. Atlas lowered his head, but he did not move. Caleb's hand settled gently between the dog's shoulders. "Stay with me," he whispered. Mason nudged the collar with the toe of his expensive sneaker, turning the metal plate toward the headlights. Mud slid from its surface. A line of stamped letters caught the light. At the edge of the crowd, a silver-haired man in a dark wool coat suddenly stopped breathing. His umbrella slipped from his hand and struck the pavement. He stared at the plate as though the past had risen from the ground to meet him. Then he stepped into the rain, his face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Mason glanced back, annoyed. "Dad, it's just some dog collar." Richard Whitmore did not look at his son. His eyes remained on Atlas. The old German shepherd turned toward him, ears forward, body motionless. Richard's voice broke into a whisper. "No," he said. "That dog was reported dead." By Friday morning, the Whitmore name hung over the town like a polished brass sign no one dared to touch. Their family owned the new shopping plaza, half the rental properties near the river, and the large white house overlooking the county road. They funded school uniforms, holiday lights, and the annual Veterans Breakfast at St. Matthew's Hall. Their generosity appeared in photographs. Their influence lived in quieter places. A phone call could erase a complaint. A donation could soften a headline. Richard Whitmore had built that power slowly, presenting himself as a disciplined businessman who believed every problem had a practical solution. His son had learned a different lesson. Mason believed every consequence had a price, and his father would always pay it. At 20 years old, Mason moved through town with the confidence of someone who had never been required to apologize. His black sport utility vehicle cost more than Caleb's house. His watch flashed beneath every camera he raised. He and his friends, Trent Hale and Bryce Mercer, had gathered thousands of online followers by recording pranks that were funny only to the people holding the phones. They blocked grocery aisles, mocked tired workers, and left large tips only after making servers perform for them. Each time someone objected, Mason smiled as though offense itself were part of the entertainment. That afternoon, the three of them parked outside the Whitmore Community Center, where volunteers were preparing for Saturday's Veterans Fundraiser. A banner stretched across the entrance, carrying Richard's name in letters nearly as large as the word honor. Mason filmed himself beneath it. "Big weekend," he told the camera. "My family keeping this town alive again." Trent laughed. Bryce turned the phone toward an elderly custodian carrying folding chairs through the side door. Mason stepped into the man's path, asking him to salute the donor's son. The custodian simply moved around him. Mason's smile tightened. He hated being ignored more than being challenged. Across town, Caleb finished replacing a water pump on a delivery van while Atlas rested in a patch of late sunlight near the garage. The air smelled of warm rubber, motor oil, and rain gathering somewhere beyond the hills. A radio played softly from the workbench, reporting road closures for the fundraiser. Caleb reached for a wrench, then paused when the announcer mentioned Richard Whitmore's military service. Atlas lifted his head at the name. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but Caleb noticed. "You remember too much," he said. Atlas rose and crossed the concrete floor, his nails clicking in a slow, familiar rhythm. Caleb knelt beside him and ran his thumb beneath the old collar, checking the leather where it had begun to crack near the buckle. For a moment, his fingers rested over the hidden metal plate. 7 names were stamped on the back. 7 lives carried out of dust, smoke, and darkness. One belonged to a young lieutenant who had disappeared from Caleb's life before either of them understood what survival would cost. Caleb had seen Richard Whitmore's face on billboards and newspaper pages for years. Richard had never seen his. That was how Caleb preferred it. He stood and looked toward the cloudy western sky. "We stay quiet," he told Atlas. The German shepherd watched him without blinking. At that same moment, Mason's vehicle turned onto Main Street. He spotted the open garage, the old pickup, and the dog sitting beside the silent mechanic. He slowed again. This time, he did not drive past. He lowered his window and lifted his phone, studying Caleb and Atlas as though he had just found something new to use. Saturday arrived beneath a clear blue sky, the kind that made every polished window in the Whitmore Community Center shine like a promise. American flags moved gently along the entrance, and the smell of coffee, grilled burgers, and fresh-cut grass drifted through the crowded parking lot. Veterans in old service caps stood beside families, volunteers carried donation boxes, and children chased balloons between rows of folding tables. Caleb had not planned to attend. He came only because Mrs. Delaney from the hospital had asked him to check a loose battery cable in her station wagon. Atlas walked beside him at an easy pace, his weathered collar resting beneath the thick fur at his neck. People greeted the dog before they greeted Caleb. Atlas accepted each careful hand with quiet patience, but his attention never wandered far from the man beside him. Near the main entrance, Mason leaned against his black sport utility vehicle while Trent filmed him. Bryce stood nearby, laughing at something on his phone. Mason noticed Caleb almost immediately. His eyes moved from the faded work jacket to the old pickup parked near the curb, then settled on Atlas. "There is our local hero," he said loudly enough for several people to hear. Caleb kept walking. Atlas did the same. Mason stepped away from the vehicle, disappointed by the lack of reaction. Before he could speak again, a bright red ball bounced from the children's activity area and rolled across the pavement. A boy no older than 6 ran after it, slipping between 2 parked cars without looking. At that same moment, Mason reached through his open window to start the vehicle. The engine came alive with a deep roar. Music pulsed through the speakers. Mason glanced toward Trent's phone instead of the lane ahead and eased his foot onto the accelerator. Atlas heard the change before anyone else did. His ears rose. His body tightened. Then he moved. The German shepherd crossed the short distance in 3 swift strides and pressed his shoulder against the child, guiding him backward toward the curb. The boy fell safely onto the grass, surprised but unharmed, while the red ball disappeared beneath the vehicle. Mason stopped less than 2 feet from where the child had been standing. Silence spread across the lot. Caleb reached the boy first and knelt beside him. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The child shook his head and wrapped both arms around Atlas's neck. His mother rushed forward, breathless, whispering thanks through tears. Mason stepped out of the vehicle and looked at the pale scratch running along the lower edge of the driver's door, left by Atlas's collar buckle as the dog moved past. His face hardened. "That dog damaged my car." Caleb stood slowly. "He moved a child out of your path." Mason looked toward the phones now pointed in his direction. "He ran at me. Everybody saw it." The boy's mother stared at him. "You were not watching the road." Richard Whitmore appeared at the top of the center steps, drawn by the sudden quiet. Mason immediately changed his tone. He claimed Atlas had lunged without warning. He called the dog unstable. Richard listened with a troubled expression, but habit moved faster than truth. He asked security to file an incident report and told Caleb that animal control might require a behavioral evaluation. Caleb did not argue. He looked toward the cameras mounted above the entrance. "Check every recording," he said. Atlas stood beside the child, the boy's small hand resting against his fur. Richard followed Caleb's gaze toward the nearest camera. Mason did too. For the first time that morning, confidence left his face. The red light above the lens was still blinking. The security office closed at 6, but Mason was already waiting beside his vehicle when the last volunteer left the community center. The evening light had faded behind the hills, leaving the parking lot under a row of pale lamps. Rain had begun to gather in the air, not yet falling, but close enough to sharpen the smell of asphalt and cold metal. Trent leaned against the rear door with his phone in hand. Bryce watched the side entrance. Mason had spent the afternoon trying to learn who controlled the camera recordings. The answer had not reassured him. The center manager had copied everything before Richard could intervene. By Monday morning, the truth would be sitting on a county desk. "He needs to change his story," Mason said. Trent looked up. "The mechanic?" "The veteran," Mason replied. "And the dog." Caleb finished work shortly after 7. He locked the garage, checked the latch twice, and guided Atlas into the passenger side of the pickup. The German shepherd moved carefully because the old stiffness in his hind leg had returned after the morning's sudden sprint. Caleb noticed, as he noticed everything about Atlas, but he said nothing until they stopped near a small diner on the south end of town. "We will rest here," he murmured. The diner was nearly empty. Warm light spilled through the windows, and the smell of coffee drifted into the damp evening. Caleb ordered a bowl of water for Atlas and sat near the back wall. He had just reached for the cup when Atlas lifted his head. Outside, A black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly past the window, then disappeared behind the building. Caleb watched the reflection fade from the glass. He placed several bills beneath the coffee mug and stood. The rear parking lot was darker than the front, sheltered by brick walls and a line of tall cedar trees. Rain began as a soft tapping against the metal dumpsters. Caleb and Atlas had crossed only half the lot when Mason stepped from beside the vehicle. Trent followed with his phone raised. Bryce remained near the driver's door. "We just want to talk," Mason said. Caleb stopped several feet away. Atlas remained at his left side. "Then talk." Mason smiled toward the camera. "Tell everyone your dog ran at my car. Tell them you overreacted." Caleb's face did not change. "The cameras will tell them what happened. Cameras can be misunderstood." "Not this time." Mason moved closer. His shoes splashed through a shallow puddle. "You think anybody is going to choose your word over my family's?" Caleb glanced at the phone, then at the security light above the diner's rear entrance. Its small red indicator glowed steadily. "I do not need them to choose my word." Trent lowered the phone for a moment. Mason noticed and snapped. "Keep recording." Then he turned back to Caleb. "Maybe the dog should be tested. Maybe somebody decides he is dangerous." Atlas stood perfectly still, ears forward, breathing slow. Mason waved one hand near him, hoping for a reaction. Atlas did not offer one. Bryce tossed a piece of food onto the wet pavement. "Come on, boy," he said with a laugh. Atlas never looked down. Caleb's fingers relaxed beside his thigh, giving a silent signal. "Stay?" Mason's smile faded. He had expected fear, anger, anything he could use. What he received was discipline. He stepped closer and reached toward the old collar. Caleb's voice lowered. "Do not." For the first time, Atlas looked back at him. Their eyes met, and something passed between them without sound. Not panic. Memory. A command learned long ago in places where restraint mattered more than pride. Protect. Do not punish. Mason closed his hand around the worn leather. The buckle shifted. A thin metal plate struck against it with a quiet chime. From the diner doorway came the sound of someone stepping into the ring. Mason did not turn. He pulled once more, and the collar slipped free. The collar fell into the puddle between them, and for one quiet second, even the rain seemed to hesitate. Atlas did not move toward it. He stayed beside Caleb, head lowered, amber eyes fixed on the worn leather as water spread across the stamped metal plate. Mason looked down and gave a careless laugh. "That is what this is about," he said. "An old tag." Caleb's face remained still, but his hand rested against Atlas's shoulder with a tenderness that did not match the cold parking lot where the phones pointed at them. "Put it down," he said. Mason nudged the collar with the edge of his shoe, turning the plate toward the security light. Mud slipped away from the first line. "Atlas. Military working dog. 2nd Marine Logistics Group." Trent stopped filming himself and aimed the phone closer. Bryce no longer smiled. A second plate, thinner and darker with age, had been sewn beneath the leather. Mason bent down and pulled it free. On one side were a date and a set of coordinates. On the other were 7 names, each stamped in narrow block letters. The last name read Lieutenant Richard Whitmore. The diner door opened behind them. Richard stepped beneath the awning without an umbrella, his dark coat open at the collar. He had followed Mason after receiving a call from the community center manager, expecting another argument he could quietly settle. Then he saw the metal plate in his son's hand. Color left his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Mason glanced over his shoulder. "Dad, it is just some military thing." Richard walked into the ring. He did not seem to feel it. His eyes moved from the plate to Atlas, then to Caleb. The years between them narrowed in silence. Atlas lifted his ears. Richard stopped several feet away, breathing as though the cold air had suddenly become too thin. "That dog was reported lost," he whispered. Caleb's answer was calm. "He was reported beyond recovery." Richard stared at him. A memory returned in fragments. A collapsed field station overseas, dust filling the air, radios fading beneath the confusion, and a young German shepherd refusing to leave a buried section of concrete. Richard had been trapped there for hours. He remembered a dog's breath near his face. He remembered a Marine's voice telling him to stay awake. He remembered waking later in a medical tent and being told the handler had gone back for the dog. No one ever told him what happened after that. "You were there," Richard said. Caleb looked down at Atlas. "We both were." Richard's eyes fell to the 7 names. Those were the people he found. Those were the people we brought home, Caleb replied. The difference was small, but Richard heard it. Caleb had never kept the plate as a trophy. He had kept it as a record of lives that mattered equally. Mason looked from his father to the dog, confusion replacing confidence. You know them? Richard took the tag from his son with both hands. His fingers trembled as he wiped away the remaining rain. They saved my life. The words carried farther than his voice should have allowed. Trent lowered the phone. Bryce stepped back toward the vehicle. Atlas remained still, his old hind legs stiff beneath him, waiting for Caleb rather than recognition. Richard crouched slowly and held the collar at eye level. Atlas studied him, then gave one quiet breath through his nose. Richard's eyes filled, but he did not reach forward. Some gratitude arrives too late to ask for touch. Behind them, Mason's live stream continued, sending every word beyond the parking lot. Richard rose and looked at his son. For the first time, there was no lawyer in his expression, no donor, no man measuring the cost of a mistake. There was only a father standing beside the creature who had once carried him back to life, realizing his own child had treated that life as worthless. Richard stood beneath the parking lot lights with rain running from his hair to the collar in his hands. Mason waited for the familiar rescue, the calm phone call, the private conversation that would turn consequences into inconvenience. It did not come. Richard looked toward Trent's phone, still broadcasting every face and every word, then toward the security camera above the diner door. Turn off the live stream, he said. Mason reached for the screen, but Richard took the phone first. He did not erase the video. He ended the broadcast and placed the device on the hood of the vehicle. Dad, listen to me, Mason said. They are making this look worse than it was. Richard's eyes moved to Atlas, whose wet fur clung close around his shoulders. The old German shepherd stood without growling, without pulling, without asking anyone to understand him. Caleb remained beside him, one hand resting over the place where the collar had been. No, Richard said. You made it what it was. Mason glanced at Trent and Bryce, searching for agreement. Neither spoke. The rain had washed the humor from their faces. You are taking their side over mine? Mason asked. His voice carried disbelief more than hurt. Richard looked at his son for a long moment. I am not choosing them over you. I am choosing the man you still have time to become. Mason opened his mouth, but the distant rise of sirens reached the parking lot before he could answer. Richard had already called the county sheriff while walking from the community center. He handed the collar back to Caleb carefully, supporting the leather with both palms. I should have found you, he said. Caleb took it without ceremony. You had a life to return to. Richard looked toward Mason. And I did not honor it very well. 2 patrol vehicles entered the lot and stopped near the diner. The deputies spoke first with Caleb, then with the employees who had watched from the doorway. The diner manager provided access to the security recording. Trent surrendered his phone when asked. Bryce admitted they had followed Caleb from town because Mason wanted him to change his account of the morning. Each fact arrived quietly. There was no shouting, no dramatic confession, only the steady weight of truth settling where money could not move it. Mason looked to his father again when a deputy asked him to remain beside the vehicle. Richard did not reach for his contacts. He did not mention the family name. Instead, he gave the officers the community center manager's information and confirmed that the earlier camera footage had been preserved. You cannot do this, Mason whispered. Richard's face tightened. I should have done it years ago. Caleb fastened the old collar around Atlas's neck, checking the buckle twice. The metal plate rested once more beneath the dog's fur. Atlas leaned briefly against Caleb's leg, then turned his gaze toward Mason. There was no triumph in his amber eyes, only attention, the kind he had once given dark roads, broken buildings, and men waiting to be found. Mason lowered his head first. Richard watched him, and something in the father seemed to break without making a sound. Caleb began walking toward his pickup, but Richard called his name. Sergeant Rowe. Caleb stopped. Richard stood in the rain with his hands empty. Thank you for bringing me home. Caleb looked at Atlas before answering. He found you. I only followed. Then Atlas took one slow step toward the truck, and Caleb went with him. Behind them, the red light above the diner camera continued to glow. Preserving the night, a powerful man finally chose not to protect his son from the truth. The first hearing took place 3 weeks later in a county courtroom that smelled of old wood, floor wax, and rain carried in on winter coats. Mason sat beside his attorney without the confidence he had worn in the parking lot. Trent and Bryce sat farther back with their families. Richard occupied a bench alone. He had refused to ask for favors, refused to contact donors, and refused every suggestion that the matter could be reduced to youthful carelessness. The video from the diner had already spread across the state. So had the recording from the community center, showing Atlas guiding the child away from Mason's vehicle. Yet Caleb did not intend to watch anyone fall. He sat instead in a veterinary clinic 10 miles outside town, one hand resting on Atlas's shoulder while a specialist examined the stiffness in the dog's hind leg. The sudden movement at the fundraiser and the strain in the parking lot had aggravated an old service injury. The treatment would require weeks of rest, careful therapy, and a procedure Caleb could not easily afford. When the receptionist quietly explained the cost, he looked through the glass at Atlas lying on a padded mat. "Schedule it," he said. "We will figure out the rest." By noon, the court accepted a resolution built around accountability rather than spectacle. Mason would complete hundreds of hours of supervised service at a rehabilitation center for retired working dogs. He would attend responsibility counseling, pay restitution, and make a public correction of every false statement he had made about Atlas. Trent and Bryce received similar requirements based on their roles. None of them would be allowed to turn the service into online content. No phones, no branding, no applause. Caleb had been asked for his opinion before the agreement was finalized. He did not request the harshest penalty. "Make him care for something that cannot be impressed by his name," he said. Richard heard those words later and carried them home like a verdict. Within days, he resigned as chairman of the community center board. At a public meeting, he admitted that his donations had too often been used as a shield for Mason's behavior. He transferred the remaining Whitmore sponsorship funds into an independent trust for retired military and police dogs, then removed the family name from the Veterans Hall. The new sign was smaller. It simply read the Working Dog Recovery Fund. Mason began his service on a gray Monday morning. His first assignment was not heroic. He scrubbed water bowls, folded blankets, and cleaned kennel floors beneath the watch of a supervisor who did not care who his father was. Near the end of the shift, he met Boone, an aging Labrador retriever with one front leg and cloudy eyes. Boone had spent years locating survivors after disasters. Now he moved slowly and distrusted unfamiliar hands. Mason approached too quickly, and Boone turned away. "You cannot force trust," the supervisor told him. "You earn it at the speed it is offered." The sentence followed Mason through the week. He began sitting outside Boone's kennel during breaks, saying nothing. On the 5th day, Boone accepted a treat from his open palm. Mason did not smile for a camera. There was no camera. That same evening, Caleb returned home after Atlas's procedure. Snow had begun to fall, soft and clean against the dark roof. He helped Atlas onto a blanket beside the couch, then climbed onto a chair and reached for the wooden box above the shelf. He had not opened it in years. Inside were medals, faded photographs, a burned section of leash, and a folded report bearing 7 names. Caleb placed the box on the floor. Atlas lifted his head. For the first time since coming home from overseas, Caleb allowed the past to remain in the room without hiding it. Winter loosened its grip on the town 6 months later, leaving patches of snow beneath the pines and clear streams of water along the curbs. Atlas had regained strength slowly. His steps were steadier now, though Caleb still shortened their walks when the old leg grew tired. On a quiet Saturday morning, they returned to the Working Dog Recovery Center for a final evaluation. Sunlight poured through the high windows, warming the concrete floors and carrying the clean scent of soap, cedar shavings, and fresh coffee from the staff room. Mason was already there. He wore plain work clothes and rubber boots, with no expensive watch and no phone in his hand. He had spent the morning washing bedding and preparing meals for the older dogs. Boone followed him at a slow pace, close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed Mason's knee. The young man had changed in ways that were difficult to photograph. He listened before speaking. He waited before reaching. He had learned that trust could not be purchased, hurried, or demanded. When Atlas entered beside Caleb, Mason stopped near the end of the hallway. Boone sat at his feet. For several seconds, no one moved. Atlas recognized him. His ears lifted, and his amber eyes remained steady. Mason lowered his gaze. "I kept something for you," he said, from a nearby cabinet. He removed a small cloth bundle and placed it on a bench. Inside was Atlas's old collar. The cracked leather had been cleaned and carefully repaired, but not replaced. Every worn edge remained. Every mark stayed where time had put it. The metal plate had been polished just enough for the 7 names to be read clearly. Mason picked it up with both hands, then paused. He did not step closer. "I thought fixing it would be enough," he said. It was not. Caleb studied him without judgment. Behind Mason, Richard stood near the office doorway. He had come quietly and kept his distance. Since the night in the parking lot, he had visited the center each week, usually to handle paperwork or repair something that carried no plaque. Mason looked at Atlas. "I am sorry," he said. "Not because everyone found out. Because you protected someone, and I treated your restraint like weakness." Atlas watched him. The room held only the hum of the heating vents and Boone's soft breathing. Mason knelt and placed the collar on the floor between them. He kept his hands at his sides. Atlas walked forward slowly. He sniffed the repaired leather, then lifted his eyes toward Caleb. Caleb gave one small nod. Mason picked up the collar and offered it. Caleb accepted it, fastening it gently around Atlas's neck. The old plate settled beneath the thick fur with its familiar quiet chime. Then Atlas did something no one expected. He crossed the final step between them and sat beside Mason. His tail touched the floor once. Only once. Mason closed his eyes as if receiving something too large for words. He did not reach for the dog. He simply remained there, shoulder near shoulder, grateful for the space Atlas had chosen to share. Richard turned toward the window, hiding the tears that had already gathered. Caleb rested one hand on Atlas's back. "Come on, partner," he said softly. Atlas rose, but before following Caleb toward the door, he looked back at Mason. Outside, the morning sun had broken through the last clouds of winter. Caleb and Atlas walked toward the old pickup together, their shadows stretching across the wet pavement. Behind them, Mason returned to Boone and the unfinished work. No one applauded. No one called it forgiveness. But sometimes grace does not arrive as a grand declaration. Sometimes it is only an old dog sitting beside a young man who has finally learned how to be still.